My parents told me they were putting our family cabin in my brother's name alone, and the reason they gave was that I'd always have my career to fall back on, while he needed something solid under his feet. That was the word they used. Solid. As if 26 years of showing up, of being the one who never asked for anything, had made me into something that didn't need ground to stand on. I'm 31. I work as a structural engineer in Calgary, and the cabin in question sits on a stretch of lakefront near Invermere that my grandfather bought in 1968 for less than what a used Honda costs now. It isn't a mansion. It's 4 bedrooms, a dock that needs new boards every other spring, and a wood stove that smells like my entire childhood. My grandfather left it to my parents with one instruction, spoken to me directly when I was 17 and he knew he was dying. Keep it in the family, split fair, don't let anyone get greedy over it. My brother is Wesley. He's 34, and for as long as I can remember, he has been the reason our household ran on a different set of rules depending on who was breaking them. When I missed curfew at 16, I lost my phone for a month. When Wesley wrapped my mother's car around a hydro pole at 19, drunk, with a girl in the passenger seat who needed 4 stitches above her eyebrow, my father called it a learning experience and bought him a newer car 8 months later. Wesley has been engaged twice and married once, briefly, to a woman who left him after he emptied their joint savings account into a crypto scheme he'd seen on a podcast. He has gone through 4 jobs in 6 years, each ending the same way: a falling out, a grievance against a boss who didn't get him, a stretch of unemployment my parents quietly funded while telling relatives he was between opportunities. I'm not telling you this to make him sound like a monster. He isn't. He's just a man who has never once had to sit with the consequences of being himself, because 2 people made it their life's work to absorb those consequences for him. And I was the proof that it was possible to do things differently, which somehow made me less interesting to love. The dinner where they told me about the cabin happened on a Saturday in late October, my mother's birthday, at my parents' house in Canmore. I'd driven up from Calgary that morning with a bottle of the Okanagan Red she liked and a cashmere scarf I'd actually thought about, the kind of gift you choose because you know someone, not because you're filling an obligation. My father was carving a turkey he was visibly proud of, a new smoker he'd bought himself for the occasion, and Wesley was already 2 beers in when I walked through the door, sprawled on the couch with his girlfriend Sloane, a woman I'd met exactly twice, who spoke to my mother like she was already planning the wedding. Dinner itself was fine. Pleasant, even. My mother told a story about her sister in Kelowna. My father asked about a bridge inspection project I'd been leading downtown, and for about an hour I let myself believe this was just a normal family dinner, the kind other people have without flinching. Then my father set down his fork, the way men of his generation do when they've rehearsed something, and said he and my mother had been talking, and they wanted to get ahead of any confusion before the holidays. He said the cabin needed to go to someone who would actually use it, someone who'd be raising a family there, someone who needed the stability of an asset behind him as he got back on his feet after the divorce. He said I had my condo, my pension, my career. I had built something, and they were proud of that, but it meant I didn't need the cabin the way Wesley did. He said it like he was handing me a compliment wrapped around a theft. My mother nodded along, refilling Sloane's wine glass without meeting my eyes, which told me she'd already made her peace with this, maybe months ago. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth and felt the floor of the evening drop out from under me. Not rage. Something colder and more familiar than rage. The particular quiet of being told, once again, that the reward for managing your own life responsibly is watching the resources meant for you get redirected toward the person who couldn't. I thought about my grandfather's voice, the weight of his hand on my shoulder the last time I saw him conscious, telling me to keep it fair. I thought about every summer I'd spent restaining that dock alone, while Wesley was off somewhere being forgiven for something. I thought about the fact that I had quietly been sending my parents $400 a month for the past 2 years toward their property taxes on that cabin, because they'd mentioned once, almost offhand, that things were tight, and I hadn't wanted them to feel ashamed asking. They had never told Wesley that. They had never told Wesley anything that might have required something of him. I put my fork down. I asked one question. I asked whose name was currently on the title. My father said it didn't matter yet, that they hadn't finalized anything with the lawyer, that this was just them being transparent with me before they moved forward. And I understood, in that moment, exactly what was happening. This wasn't a discussion. This was a courtesy notification. They weren't asking what I thought. They were telling me how it was going to be and waiting for me to do what I'd always done, which was accept it gracefully so the evening could stay pleasant. So I said one word. I said, understood. Not that's not fair. Not let's talk about this. Just understood. Flat and final, like a door easing shut instead of slamming. Because slamming would have given them something to react to, and I didn't want to give them anything anymore. My father nodded, satisfied, the way you nod when a difficult conversation has gone exactly as planned. My mother exhaled. Wesley, who had said nothing through any of this, finally looked up from his phone and gave me a small, grateful smile as if I'd just done him a favor. I stayed another 40 minutes. I helped clear the table. I hugged my mother goodbye and told her happy birthday and meant it, because somewhere underneath all of this, she was still my mother and I still loved her, even as I understood with total clarity that love had never been the thing standing between me and being treated fairly in that house. I drove back to Calgary that night instead of staying over like I'd planned. 2.5 hours on a dark highway with my hands tight on the wheel and the radio off, because I needed the silence to think. By the time I got home, it wasn't sadness anymore. It was clarity, the kind that arrives uninvited and doesn't leave room for negotiation. I sat at my kitchen table at almost 1 a.m. with my laptop open and pulled up every transfer I'd made to my parents over the past 2 years. 48 transfers. Just over $19,000, all of it earmarked, in my head if nowhere official, for a property tax bill on a cabin that was about to belong entirely to a man who had never once asked me how I was doing without segueing into asking for something. I didn't sleep. By 4 a.m, I had drafted an email to a real estate lawyer I'd worked with years earlier on an unrelated property dispute for a client, asking for 30 minutes of her time. I had also opened a folder on my laptop and started saving screenshots. Bank transfers, a text from my mother 18 months ago thanking me for helping with the taxes, don't tell Wes, he'll feel bad, and an old email chain from when my grandfather was alive, in which he'd ceded both me and a family lawyer, laying out in writing that the cabin was meant to be split equally between his 2 grandchildren when the time came, contingent on my parents holding it in trust until then. I had never thought much of that email. It had felt, for years, like a formality, a grandfather covering his bases. That night, it felt like the only solid thing in the entire situation. I didn't call my parents the next day. I let their texts go to voicemail, 3 from my mother, 1 from my father, all some version of hoping I understood where they were coming from. I went to work. I led a site walkthrough on a pedestrian bridge retrofit. I ate lunch at my desk. I answered emails about load tolerances. And underneath all of it, I kept circling back to that email from my grandfather like a compass point. I met with the lawyer, Priscilla Whitfield, 3 days later. I brought my laptop, my folder of screenshots, and a printed copy of my grandfather's email. She read through everything twice, the second time more slowly, and then she looked up at me and said the words that changed the shape of everything that followed. She said the email, combined with the original 1968 deed language, and the way my grandfather's estate had been structured, created what was very likely an enforceable, equitable interest. That my grandfather hadn't simply left the cabin to my parents outright, he'd left it to them in trust, with explicit, written, time-stamped intent that it pass equally to his grandchildren. My parents hadn't been free to do whatever they wanted with it. They'd been managing an obligation they either hadn't understood or had chosen to ignore once it became inconvenient. I want to be honest with you about what I felt hearing that. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and sadder, the confirmation that the unfairness I'd lived with my whole life hadn't just been a feeling. It had, this whole time, also been a fact, written down, dated, witnessed, sitting in a file somewhere waiting for someone to finally open it. Priscilla sent a formal letter to my parents 2 weeks later, outlining the trust language, the original intent, and a request for clarification before any transfer of title proceeded. I didn't write it. I didn't choose the wording. I simply told her to be accurate and let the law speak for itself. My mother called me the night the letter arrived. She was not crying the way I expected. She was furious, in the brittle, wounded way people get when they've been caught doing something they'd convinced themselves wasn't really wrong. She asked me how I could do this to my own family, how I could bring lawyers into something that should have stayed between us, how Wesley was going to feel humiliated. I asked her one question back. I asked her whose idea it had actually been to leave my name off the title. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words arrive, and then she admitted quietly that it had been Wesley who'd asked. Not begged, not even particularly emotional about it. He'd simply mentioned, a few months back, that it would make things easier if the cabin were just in his name, since he was the one who'd actually be living near it after he relocated to be closer to Sloane's family in Cranbrook. My father had agreed because, in her words, he didn't want to upset him during a hard time. A hard time. Wesley's hard time was a divorce he'd caused by lying about money. My hard time, apparently, didn't qualify as a category that mattered, because I'd never been dramatic enough about mine to make anyone uncomfortable. I told my mother I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I told her I was trying to make sure my grandfather's actual wishes were honored instead of quietly buried, because honoring them was less convenient than giving in to whoever complained the loudest. She didn't have a response to that. She told me she needed time and hung up. What happened over the following month unfolded slower than I expected and uglier than I wanted. My father, it turned out, had already begun the paperwork to transfer the title before consulting any lawyer of his own. He'd assumed, apparently, that family loyalty would make the whole thing go away quietly if he just moved fast enough. Discovering that there was a binding trust document, complicating that plan didn't humble him. It made him defensive in a way I hadn't seen from him before, calling me twice to accuse me of weaponizing Grandpa's memory for my own gain, as if protecting the explicit written terms of an inheritance was some kind of manipulation, rather than the opposite of it. Wesley texted me exactly once during that month. He said I was being selfish, that I didn't need the cabin the way he did, that I'd always made things harder than they needed to be. I didn't respond. There was nothing in that message that deserved one. The thing that finally broke the standoff wasn't the lawyer's letter. It was Sloane. I found out later through my mother, in one of those conversations where grief makes people say more than they intend to, that Sloane had pulled my father aside at some point during all of this and asked, very plainly, whether the cabin actually belonged to Wesley outright or whether there was some kind of complication with the sister. She'd apparently already been looking into the property, checking comparable values nearby, asking a friend in real estate what a renovated lakefront place like that might be worth in 5 years. She wasn't asking because she cared about fairness. She was asking because she'd been planning, quietly, around an asset she assumed was already secured, and the idea that it might not be hit a nerve in her faster than any moral argument ever could with Wesley. When my father admitted there was, in fact, a real legal complication, Sloane's interest in Wesley's financial trajectory seemed to cool with startling speed. 3 weeks later, Wesley called my mother to say Sloane had moved back to Cranbrook without him. He didn't mention the cabin in that call. He didn't need to. Everyone understood what had actually fallen apart. I'd love to tell you I felt nothing watching that unfold, that I'd become someone above the small, human satisfaction of watching a person who called me selfish lose something he'd been counting on. I didn't feel nothing. I felt a complicated, unglamorous mix of vindication and sadness, because somewhere in there was still my brother, alone in an apartment in Cranbrook, finding out the hard way that some relationships are built on what you have rather than who you are. My father called me in December, almost 2 months after that dinner. He didn't apologize right away. He talked around it for a while about how stressful the year had been, about how he'd been trying to do right by both of us and hadn't seen a clean way to do it. I let him talk. And then finally, he said the thing I hadn't realized I'd been waiting 2 months to hear. He said he'd been wrong. He said he'd let Wesley's crisis become the only crisis that counted in that house for so long that he'd stopped noticing what it cost the rest of us, what it had cost me specifically, for years, without complaint. He said the cabin would be split the way my grandfather intended, 50-50 on paper, with both our names on the title, and that he was sorry it had taken a lawyer's letter for him to actually look at what he'd been doing. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo 20 years of unequal weather in that house. But it was the first time my father had said the word wrong about anything involving Wesley without immediately following it with an excuse. And I believed he meant it, as much as I'm able to believe anything about a man who's had a lifetime of practice protecting his own comfort. My mother and I are still working it out, slower, more careful, the way you rebuild trust with someone who let you down not through cruelty but through the much quieter failure of never quite choosing you when it counted. We talk most weeks now. She asked me, recently, if I'd come up to the cabin in the spring to help pick out paint for the deck, an ordinary domestic question that would have meant nothing a year ago and meant almost everything now, because it assumed a future where the cabin was mine too, not something I was being generously permitted to visit. Wesley and I haven't spoken since that one text. I don't know if we will. I've stopped trying to map out what reconciliation has to look like or how fast it's supposed to happen. What I know is that the cabin sits exactly the way it was always supposed to sit, half mine on paper and in truth, and that the version of me who used to confuse silence with peace doesn't live in my house anymore. I paid for that lesson in full, and I'm not interested in a refund. If you've ever been the responsible one, the one whose stability got mistaken for not needing anything at all, you already understand why I'm telling you this.